Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues brings expert guests to the airwaves to talk through your divorce questions and fill in the gray areas about separating. From thinking about divorce to how to behave during divorce to what to do after, this is Divorce Dialogue. Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. I'm the founder of the Miller Law Group and a trainer at the Center for Understanding in Conflict, and I am on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. And my guest today is Lyerly Spongberg. She's a divorce coach who brings both professional training and her own lived experience to her work. After navigating her own high conflict divorce as a single mother and later blending a family of 6, she understands that divorce is not just a legal process, but a deeply human one. As a DCA certified ADR divorce coach, and Lyerly, we can talk about what that means later on, also a certified pre-mediation divorce coach, a co-parenting specialist, and a trauma-informed coach, Lyerly helps people reduce conflict, minimize emotional and financial strain, and make clear, grounded decisions during one of life's most challenging transitions. Welcome, Lyerly Spongberg, to Divorce Dialogues.
Nice to have you. And it's Spongberg. I know everybody like
Spongberg. I'm sorry. Thank
that's
you so
okay.
much for saying that, because otherwise I can
You
imagine that's a tough name to have.
it is. And sometimes it becomes SpongeBob. So I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
yes. Well, we could talk about those kinds of things that people do, but my apologies, Spongberg.
Not
So, Lyerly, I know that your journey into divorce coaching started with your own experience, and I wonder if you'd be willing to share what that period was like and how it ultimately inspired the work that you're doing today.
That's a great question because I think a lot of the reason people become divorce coaches is because of what their experience with divorce was like. Mine was scary. It was overwhelming, depressing. It's really sad. I kind of liken it to being blindfolded and thrown in a washing machine because it's sort of all these different cycles that, spinning and draining and it's sort of on repeat. And you can't, for me, it wasn't something that I knew how to navigate or sort of get out of, but I still had to get up every morning and take care of my 2 young daughters and take them to school and do all those things. So and it was a navigating a lot of different emotions that were big and still having to make it okay. And I think living through that taught me that I could survive it, and I did. And getting on the other side it really did inspire my work after I muddled my way through it and realized there was so much I didn't even know I didn't know. And many years later, going back and realizing there is a much better way to do that, legally, emotionally, and just overall, I think it would have benefited not only me, but my family as well.
I think what you're saying is that if you'd known a little bit more about what you were getting into and about the options that you had, it might have been a different experience for you. Is that right?
It is. And I think, this was over 20 years ago. So there wasn't as much information readily available to people about the process. And I think there was a tendency to listen to other people who'd been divorced. That was sort of the source of information. And every divorce is sort of a snowflake, they're all different. So what worked for someone else or the dynamics between one couple is never exactly the same for someone else. So yeah, it was a lot of not knowing any idea about any of that and taking advice when I probably should have done more research, but not even knowing where to start.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point. And just personally and professionally, I think this is a really, and I'm curious what you think, interesting thing, right? So, because like every divorce is a snowflake, yes and no. So, lots of lawyers will say, well, basically there are 5 things that could happen. There are 5 divorces. I'm making that number up, 4, 10, whatever it is, in
Mm.
terms of what the facts are, right? From a legal perspective and what's going to be argued, there's very little that falls outside the usual kinds of things that divorce lawyers see. But and this is a big but, the feelings and the people who are coming in and the conflict dynamic they have and the money personalities they have and the way that they interact with each other and with them and their own self-knowledge about what their own priorities are, that is all really different. And so that's what makes each divorce unique. It's the people, not so much as the circumstances or the finances. Does that make sense to you, Lyerly?
Absolutely. And I think, for sure, they're the basics, right? You need to get through, we like to say peace when I coach my clients, the parenting plan, equitable distribution, alimony or spousal support, child support, and everything else. Those are the things you need to figure out. But how you figure those things out and how they're individual to your family's needs and to whatever that emotional dynamic of conflict is within that relationship changes how all those things get figured out. And I think,
Yeah.
and I'm guessing you'll agree with me, is, previously there was this idea that you go get a big attorney and you'd fight over all these things, as opposed to figuring out what's really important to you personally and to your family and agreeing on what that is, as opposed to fighting over what that is. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yes, it does. It totally makes sense. And I think that what's really interesting is that for people who are very high conflict, who feel like I've never been able to resolve this kind of thing with my spouse, how is it ever going to be that we're going to negotiate this? But the thing is that chances are, statistically speaking, 97% likely that yes, you're going to sign an agreement and it's before a judge makes a decision after a trial. So yes, you're going to be able to figure this out with help. And the with help is I'm emphasizing, bolding, and italicing that
Yeah.
because it's the help that makes it really possible to do any of that stuff. And so if you weren't able to work it out in the kitchen, you're getting divorced because you couldn't work out conflict in your own marriage, yeah, that's what we expect. And we expect to be able to help you find a way to do that through another process of negotiation, whatever form that takes.
Right. And so much of that is education and understanding what those dynamics are. Because let's face it, you know that better than anybody else does. So if you can come to an understanding of what your conflict styles are, what you're both bring to the table, then you can learn how to change that dynamic and come to an agreement that works for everybody.
Yeah. So you're talking like your own personal life as well as your own professional life, because I do that too. You know what I'm basically saying? When I was getting divorced and it was ugly, right? What was I going through? And not that my divorce colors everybody else's divorce, but it sort of gives you that sense that, wow, this is really hard. This is really scary. There's a lot going through. So I'm wondering how your own personal experience, your lived experience, shapes the work that you do that's different than someone who might be approaching their coaching without that experience.
I think there are two important things. One, just having been divorced doesn't make you a great coach. That's
Definitely
one.
not. It could, in fact,
And
it could make you a worse coach.
right.
It could.
Yeah, and I think what I feel like I bring to it, my divorce was took a couple years and was pretty conflicted. And I think what I can bring to that is that I don't have to imagine what it's like when my clients tell me they've stayed up all night worrying about, if their kids are going to stay in the same school or how their heart races and their palms sweat when they get a nasty text from their ex. I know how that feels. I know how overwhelming it is. I know it can be paralyzing sometimes. So I bring that real knowledge and I mean, sort of somatic understanding of what that feels like. And I think that's important because people sometimes are ashamed or they feel guilty that this is so hard. They don't know how to express that. They're trying to be really strong and on the inside they're falling apart. So I know what that feels like. I also, my remarriage to a widower and bringing four kids into my family with two kids, so raising six children for the past 18 years is something that it's a depth and breadth of experience in many different ways. So I feel like I've done divorce, I've done recovery, I've done step parenting and rebuilding. All those things I think give me a unique perspective on what it is someone's going through or trying to figure out.
Yeah. I'm a step parent too, and I've been one for 26 years and lived together for a year before that too. So I took my two children from my first marriage and my husband's two children from his first marriage. And then we have a child together. So I
Hmm.
hear you on understanding that. And sometimes clients will say to me, well, how did you figure out how to repartner? You're like, what? And I'm like, well, each of these stages is different. It's quite once you think about putting a family together, it's not like dating again. Dating again is way different than when you say, all right, now we're going to move in, we're going to bring our families together,
Very different.
right?
Yep.
And that is requires a lot of intention, I think, intentional thought, because it isn't just going to be like, oh, rainbows and unicorns.
It's definitely not. And it's also, I married a widower. So we had death and divorce, and a lot of everybody had their own stuff going on. And we were putting all these people together. And I went from having two young children to having teenagers. And all these dynamics come into play, as I'm sure you know. And
Yeah,
there's this commitment when you do decide to repartner that if you have children, you've got to be all in. You've got to really sign up for what can be a really bumpy road and incredibly rewarding, but it's different. It's a different version of your family for sure.
I think it's definitely guaranteed to be a bumpy road, but it's not all bad, right? It's just
No,
that you got to anticipate those bumps. And I think parenting is a bumpy road
anyway, even in a
without a doubt.
so-called intact family. So,
Right.
so, one thing that I think, well, I say to people all the time is that usually when divorce negotiations get complicated, it's the feelings and not the finances that make it so, right? Because it's the feelings that really are what's driving that negotiation. And I know that in your work, you also emphasize the emotional and identity aspects. So, from your perspective, Lyerly, what do you think are the biggest emotional challenges that people face during divorce?
I think what hit the nail on the head with it's the identity. I think it's sort of identity free fall. I think because a divorce touches every aspect of your life. It touches, you move from we to me, you move from, us to I, you move from a certainty of where you live and where your kids go to school to what's that going to look like. So you have everything is in chaos. So that those emotions are sort of color every legal decision you need to make because you're constantly worried that if you make one decision, it's going to sort of impact all these other ones. And they do. So yeah, the emotional part and being able to get a hold of that, identify it, and really understand it so that you can establish what your values are through this process. It's really about grounding yourself when your identity, I think, is in free fall. I'm sure you're familiar with David Rock's scarf assessment, which is something I do with all my clients, which helps to define where their reactivity is coming from a lot. Are you familiar, I'm sure, with that?
Yeah, David Rock was a previous
Yeah,
podcast.
I think
Yes.
I listened
So,
to
yeah.
that. For those who don't know, those identity threats are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, which is sort of the four-letter word in divorce, which is fair. And everything, all those are impacted in divorce. Every single one of those is threatened in many different ways. As you see, I'm sure, whenever you're working with clients,
Yeah.
things don't feel fair, relationships shift, you feel like you lost your voice. Is the legal decisions going to be made for me? Like all of it. It's all the emotional parts I think need to be addressed and honored in the process.
I'm Catherine Miller, and you're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce related topics so that everyone can divorce with dignity. Please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And I'm talking today with Lyerly Spongberg about really the emotional journey of divorce. And, Lyerly, you said a minute or two ago that some people come in and they're just worried about all these things and how they don't work together. And I think that really does create like extra anxiety to the person going through the process to worry that they're not going to remember everything they need to remember. And I always encourage people to trust me to do that, right?
Mhm.
Like I, as a lawyer or a mediator, know what needs to be done. And so one thing that I think is really important for people to think about early on is what their own priorities are and what their own values are, because that's something I don't know, right? Like your values, you need to think about that, talk to me about that, write about it, and so that we can prioritize what's most important to you rather than something that I think should be most important to you, which is, I might be right, but chances are I'm wrong. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a big part of what I do as a coach is help people from the very beginning figure out what their values are, what is most important to you, and what you're willing to give up so that you go into mediation, collaboration, whatever process you're using, knowing what's really important to you. And let's hopefully that's your children, if that is children are in the mix. And how do you preserve the relationships that each of those that children have with each parent, and how do you honor that? And absolutely, you values are the most important, I think, in all of this. And it makes each decision. I mean, if you know where your values stand, then when you make a decision, you can go back and check it and make sure it does align. And then you can feel confident
Right.
about it as opposed to just thinking, oh, well, the law told me I had to do that. So I think it is. I think you're absolutely right. I love that you do that. I think writing is a great way to help people do that as well.
Yeah. So, I think that when people are getting divorced, there's a lot of loss aversion, that's happening. And it really starts to have people feel nervous that they're leaving money on the table, they're not asking for something they're entitled to, they're paying too much or something like that. Like I might be getting an unfair deal because of somebody else might have gotten a different deal in this circumstance. And it happens a lot. Well, my neighbor's cousin's friend
Right.
got, alimony of $100,000 a month for the rest of their lives. What's wrong with you?
Right.
Why
Yeah.
aren't I getting that? And so I'm making, obviously, that's a huge exaggeration, but not that big of an exaggeration. And a lot of times people might say, okay, think about your values and all. That's nice for those people who just kind of like hold hands one day and say, you know what, this just isn't working out. Let's go our own separate ways. But, for someone who experiences that a high conflict relationship or high conflict divorce, what
Hmm.
are some of the common patterns or dynamics that you see, Lyerly, in those situations, and how can you help people navigate them?
I think high conflict, I think there's a tendency, I think, and I'm sure you see this, for people to think, oh, it's super high conflict because they won't agree with me. I'm not getting what I want. That is not the definition of something that's high conflict. High conflict are patterns and histories of coercion or control or emotional issues where one person feels that they don't have the same amount of power in that negotiation or that marriage or whatever it is they're bringing to that. So those patterns of high conflict are they're they color how that negotiation is going to go down. And I think a lot of what I do with clients is help them really understand what the feelings they have, because a lot of times it's fear, or they feel intimidated, they feel manipulated, and their nervous systems are very dysregulated through something that's really high conflict. Do you see that? Is that sort of your?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a sort of like an activation that happens, right? So because and it can happen before a professional necessarily even sees it, because there's so much sort of trauma or learned trauma that's happening that they see the telltale signs, or they think they do see the telltale signs.
Right.
And I was really quite a few years into my professional life before I realized that when I didn't see it, doesn't mean it wasn't true, right? So I think I would like, oh, I'd like banded it, Sally, I didn't see that Harry said anything that was disrespectful to you. But then I'd come to learn, like, wait 1 second, all couples have the secret language, right? And that there was
Sure.
something kind of coming down the pike, and it could be crazy making to Sally in my example that I didn't see it, because anybody in their right mind would have seen this if they'd been sensitive to what was happening in the moment.
Absolutely. And in those situations, it's not, like you said, this sort of hand holding and we're going to get through this. It's more strategic communication. It's like, how do I set a boundary? How do I enforce that boundary so that I am not walking into this feeling intimidated and having those historical, patterns keep repeating? How do I help my clients interrupt that chaos so that they can make sound decisions?
Yeah.
So that's sort of the challenge there, is really coming from reactivity to strategy.
Proactive is I like to think about that. And I also think that less is more usually in communications between people. It's like, okay, and I think people come from a really good place on this. Lyerly, you and I are in conflict. If you only understood where I was coming from, you'd see that I was right. And you'd agree with me, because everybody would, right? Like everybody would think that I'm right. And when I explain and explain and explain and you still don't, it's like the wound, like the dignity violation happens again and again and again. And they just give that up. They're never
Right.
going to say, oh, you know what, Catherine? You're so, like, I mean, you laugh, and it's like, it's almost funny, but it's not funny. It's so painful when
It is
somebody feels
painful.
like this rejection over and over again.
It is. And that desire to keep explaining as if someone is going to finally get it or understand. And most likely, that's one of the reasons you're getting divorced, is because you aren't able to
100%.
communicate well. So if you weren't able to communicate well in your divorce, I mean, in your marriage, you're probably not going to communicate well in your divorce. And that's where those boundaries I was talking about are so important. And teaching my clients over and over again that no response is a perfectly valid response to something. So learning how to break whatever that cycle is of reactivity. And often it's someone having to over explain themselves. And we know the definition of insanity is asking the same question and expecting a different answer.
Yeah.
So got
Well,
to
I think
interrupt
that
that.
no response is a valid response is an interesting thing, because there's something in the law where basically there's an implication of admission if you don't say anything in defense. And I think that's an emotional thing too. If you say, well, Catherine, you're fill in the nasty word, a liar, right? And then I am like, well, if I don't respond to that, am I admitting that? And I think that's a question. I think the answer is no, and if someone feels the need to defend themselves, you could say, well, that's your perspective. I have a different one. And that's
Right.
enough, right? That you, rather than to say, well, when was I a liar? Because chances are, like, if we know each other long enough, you're going to find a time when I wasn't maybe 100% truthful, and whether it was spin or a mistake or anyway. I think that this thing about sort of high conflict and finding the boundaries and all that really comes into place, Lyerly Spongberg, on when people are co-parenting together. And
Hmm.
I know that you're trained as a co-parenting specialist, and I think that's a real challenge. So, what are some practical strategies that you can offer parents who are really trying to co-parent effectively in the midst of divorce and the conflict of some maybe their post-divorce dynamic?
I mean, there's sort of two different things. There's high conflict parenting, which sometimes co-parenting, which sometimes is better done as parallel parenting. But if people are able to get through it and they have kept their children in the center and out of the middle of all this conflict, that's really something I really coach my clients on, no matter what conflict or whatever stage they are in the sort of the intensity of the conflict, is to always try to keep children in the center and out of the middle of whatever that is. I ask, tools that I use with co-parents are to ask them to visualize really big milestones in their children's futures and how they want their children to feel in those moments. I'm talking graduations, weddings, the big game, the science fair, that thing, the ballet recital. And how do they want their child to feel in that moment? And how do they want to be with do they want their child to look on different sides of the stadium for their parents? Do they want their parents is that child going to worry about those parents being together instead of enjoying this moment of theirs? And trying to have parents stop thinking about themselves, stop thinking about winning the parenting schedule, about winning the holiday schedule, and putting themselves in the shoes of their children. And there's some other great sort of exercises I like to do. And one of them is to have parents find a photo of themselves at the age they were when what the age of their children are, and to really sit with what that felt like to be that kid and write about it and remember what that was so that they can put themselves, if it's a teenager, did they really even want to spend any time with their parents? Probably not. So all these things that come into play, because I'm sure you see this, that parenting plans and all these things become a battle. I want more time, or I want this, and as opposed to what's going to really work for this child.
Yeah. I have a long time ago had a collaborative case in which one of the children said to the child specialist in that case, listen, my parents talk about want my weekend versus your
Yeah,
weekend. This is my weekend. Can I spend it the
100%.
way I want to spend it, not because
Right.
I'm a pawn between the two of you.
Right. And you've had, when you are a co-parent, you're not going to be with your child 24/7 anymore. It's just a fact of what it is. And holidays are not going to be the same. And there are adjustments for everyone. And parents really have to think about about their kids. They have to put them first. And there are little tactics along the way to try to help influence that.
You're listening to the Divorce Dialogues podcast, and I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues has been educating people about divorce and relationship issues for over 10 years. Subscribe to the podcast, and don't forget to check out our previous episodes on the podcast website, divorcedialogues.com. And I'm talking today with Lyerly Spongberg about divorce dynamics and co-parenting. And Lyerly, if people want to learn more about you or contact you, how can they do that?
They can contact me through my website, which is Step Up with Lyerly, and that is Lyerly, because no one can ever spell my name. So stepupwithlyerly.com. I also am on Instagram at stepup_with Lyerly, where I try to post a lot of relevant content and information about the divorce process.
A couple of minutes ago, you mentioned sort of the difference between parallel parenting and co-parenting. And I think it might be interesting for our listeners, particularly if they have a high conflict parenting situation, to understand a little bit more about that distinction and the differences. Could you help us with that?
Sure. I think parallel parenting can be a great solution for parents that really haven't figured out how to get along very well post divorce. And a lot of times parallel parenting means that we're honoring the space that our children are in each one of those homes. We're facilitating that. And sometimes that means that we're dropping our kids off at a neutral place. We're giving our children a lot of space to sort of adjust from being in that other home and honoring that as a different experience. So it's instead of like, hey, come on in and drop the kids off and we'll talk a little bit about what Johnny did for the weekend. It's more, okay, Johnny's safe. We're going to meet at the McDonald's parking lot and Johnny's going to get a hug from each of us, but we're not going to interact as parents. But that the children are safe and not exposed to any conflict. That's the most important part of parallel parenting.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about that. Why is that so important that the children aren't exposed? Because I think that, listen, I think in terms of identity, which we talked about at the top of the show, an identity as a parent is a very powerful identity. And all of us want to feel and do feel, I think, for the most part, that we're committed to our identity as a parent if we are parents. And when we feel that our children are threatened or the wrong decision is being made for our children, that can bring up a very strong reaction, right, to that. So to say, like, okay, well, I'm going to pick Johnny up at Starbucks or at the police station or at the firehouse, that can feel really bad. And so I think it's really important to understand what it is that does for the child or the children.
Well, what it does for the child is that it offers a transition between these homes because the kid is also children are incredibly sensitive and they see everything. They are hearing everything. They know if their parents are fighting about something. They know it, even if the parents are doing their best to keep it hidden. So if there's a neutral place that doesn't involve, say there's a new boyfriend or there's a new girlfriend at the house, that person isn't being seen, that doesn't bring up this tension for this child. It takes away the concern that the child has for what is going to happen when that parent shows up at the other person's house. If that has not historically gone well, then you can avoid it altogether, and then that conflict is just taken out of the picture, so the kid doesn't have to worry about that. We don't want our kids to have to worry about our parents being able to act like adults.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you, listener, think of yourself as an adult, and you may well be, and that the conflict and the bad behavior, I'm going to put air quotes around that, is coming from the other person, Lyerly, like you still need to, and maybe especially then, need to think about how you're going to manage your side in order to keep your children from being exposed to the conflict between you if you are the target of conflict from the other parent. And so, do you agree with that, Lyerly?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely agree with that.
Yeah,
And that goes back to the whole idea you got to keep your children in the center of these decisions that you're
right.
making out of the middle. So if at dad's house, kids' homework isn't done until after dinner and it's always done before dinner at your house, you're going to have to let these things go. There's just that's the nature of how this relationship and families are changing.
Absolutely. All right, so I do want to talk a little bit about your certification as a coercive control and trauma-informed coach, because I think a lot of people feel going through the divorce process that they have been through trauma, like in the marriage or even maybe in the divorce process. So how does understanding coercive control change the way that you approach coaching, especially for clients who are kind of difficult in controlling relationships?
I think we touched on this a little bit when we were talking about super high conflict, because sometimes often if there is coercive control, it is typically very high conflict. And there is that real identity threats to someone's autonomy. Fairness is a big one that gets threatened with coercive. I have clients that deal with a lot of financial control. So there are a lot of power plays that come into play here. Specifically with coercive control, there can be triangulation of children, which can be very difficult for sort of the protective parent to feel alienated from their children. And sometimes that's a tactic that's used. And I'm sure you've seen this when women end up being, typically women, not always, but often women are very protective of their children, as you said before, very entwined in their role as a parent. And if there's coercive control or there's any kind of emotional abuse, and there's a concern that's happening in another home, there's a protective mama bear thing that kicks in, and that can be incredibly reactive. And that reactivity can be portrayed as I'm too emotional, I'm too crazy, I'm unfit to be, I'm not a great mom because look at her, she can't stand all these things. And that's a dynamic that can really impact women in the court system to someone who is coercively controlling them. So that's something that we coach around that ends up being more about, it's not better communication, it's very strategic communication and always about safety and exit strategies, as opposed to this kumbaya version of divorce, which we would love to have people go through, but that is certainly not the case with everyone.
So let me just back up in a second, because I think one of the things that I'm taking from what you're saying, Lyerly, is that to the extent that mama bear thing comes up and there's an emotional protective response, that could actually work against you.
100%.
Right? And it's going to work against you because you look crazy, and you're going to be perceived as portrayed as crazy by
Right.
the soon-to-be ex, right? And when taken out of context, texts, emails, and recordings can really be your enemy. And so while you're coming from a good place of wanting to protect your children, your strategy needs to come first. The strategy for the long haul needs to be
Right.
the thing you're focusing on, not the sort of moment to moment indignities of the conflict between you or the things that are being said. And that it's really important to have control over your output,
Right.
especially if it's going to be in writing or recorded.
It is, and that is really hard because as a parent, if you're a protective parent, you're a protective parent. And if you're worried about what's going on in another home or what's being said about you that's not true, or, you name it, whatever that is. And yes, it can all be used against you. And that's where you have to really, really focus on responding and not reacting. And that is not easy to do.
It is not easy, and it really helps to get coaching or therapy,
Right.
depending on your need for that. 100%
Right.
agree with that. So, Lyerly Spongberg, we are reaching the last couple of minutes of the show, and I was just wondering if there are people listening who are about to enter the divorce process or considering the divorce process or at the beginning of the divorce process. You said at the top of the show that you wish you'd known more than you know now. I'm paraphrasing, but
Absolutely. Yeah.
what is it you would want those people to know or do? What is your best advice for their first step?
I think that it's important to know that divorce isn't just about lawyers and the law and court dates and paperwork. It's like a full body, full life transition. It's something it encompasses every aspect of your life, your identity, your kids, your finances, and your nervous system. You have to prepare for this to really impact you in every way. And how you show up in the beginning and who you align yourself with is going to shape the process. That's where I think it's great to work with a divorce coach from the very beginning so that you can understand what's going to happen, what you're going to need, what experts you're going to need on your team, the different ways to get divorced, to, as we spoke about earlier, getting aligned with your values. How do you want this to look 10 years from now? And I like to help my clients reverse engineer their vision of divorce, post divorce life, so we can figure out what do we need to do now so that you end up with that vision in 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years when your kids get married. So that's one of the things I like I wish someone had told me that. I would have done a lot of things differently if I thought about what I wanted in the future as opposed to just getting
The
through the
long
next
game.
day. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Lyerly Spongberg, thank you so much for being my guest on Divorce Dialogues. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful to be here, Catherine. I appreciate the opportunity.